Good Tov. We are a little behind. We're on Lamed Amud Beis 30b2. We are up to the words Lema Pligid Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar. So the last thing we just saw was the opinion of Sumchis. Sumchis was of the opinion that when it comes to setting up an Eruv Tchumen, when it comes to setting up if you want to travel beyond the city limits, what you have to do is you have to set up food in a place that will in a place within the 2,000 cubits, 2,000 amos, and that allows you to get an additional 2,000 amos so that you can get to the next place that you want to get to. So Sumchis told us that the measurement is subjective to the individual. Whatever a person eats, whatever that person eats, whatever you eat, your Eruv is going to be the amount that you eat, whatever my Eruv is going to be the amount that I eat for 2 meals. So we're about to quote something, quote a brisa, which we're wondering now is if that is consistent or inconsistent with the view of Shimon Elazar, with the view of Sumchis. So Lema Pligid of Shimon Elazar. Let's assume that our Mishnah, which we just quoted Sumchis on, who said that it's all subjective, that would go against the following ruling of Rav Shimon Elazar. The Tanya of Shimon Elazar Omer, Rav Shimon Elazar taught in the brisa, Ma'arvin lechola lezaken k'nei mizono, that when it comes to setting up an Eruv for a sick or elderly person, sick and elderly people eat less. So you go ahead and k'nei mizono, you set it up according to the amount of food that they eat, right? So the amount of food that they eat is the amount of food that you're going to set it up. So sick or elderly person eats less, so therefore you set up less food. You only have, meaning it's you don't have to set up more. You set up the amount that fits for them. Even though most people eat more, you can set up less. Okay. When it comes to they translate it as a glutton, someone who eats a lot, someone who's very hungry, someone who eats a lot. You don't have to give as much as they normally would, as much as necessary for that person to eat. Even though they normally have a huge meal, you could set up the amount of food that's regular for a regular person. So the Gemara is wondering, this view of Rav Shimon Elazar, does that contradict, or is that inconsistent with the view of Sumchis, who said that each person according to the amount that they eat? So the Gemara answers 30b3 for those following the article. Targuma achol v'zaken. Explain that the Mishnah's teaching is talking about a sick or elderly person. So our Mishnah, meaning the Mishnah where Sumchis said it goes according to each person, there it's talking about a sick or elderly person. Meaning we're using a leniency. Meaning even though normal people eat 10 units of food, right? A sick or elderly person will eat 7 units of food, so you're allowed to do that, okay? Aval Ravtan, when it comes to a person who eats a lot, and they would eat 12 units of food, but Ladaita Asakaladam, we say that we disregard the fact that they eat more, and rather we use the norm. In other words, we are going to go leniently in both cases, and that's the Gemara's resolution. We're saying Sumchis does say it's subjective, but only when it's a leniency. It's subjective when most people eat 10 units, whatever that means, 10 units of food, right? So if it's a sick or elderly person who eats 7 is fine. If it's a gluttonous person, if a person has a huge appetite, I hate that word, it's not a good word, not a glutton, a person who has a big appetite, they eat a lot, so that person, instead of having 12, which would be a stringency, there we use the more lenient view, and we say, no, we could use the norm. So the bottom line is, it's not inconsistent with the view of Sumchis. Sumchis holds that people are able to, when we set up an Eruv Chatzer, Eruv Tchumen, we set up either the amount that is eaten by all people, or if it's less, we set up the amount that this person eats. Okay, fine. Then the Gemara questions the following halacha. Sumchis basically just established according to Sumchis that it has to be something that the individual is able to eat. So, for example, we said when it comes to truma, whereas the Tanakama in our Mishnah said that a Yisrael, a non-Kohen, is allowed to set up an Eruv using truma, even though he's not allowed to eat it, Sumcha said, no, it has to be food that he's allowed to eat, and he's not allowed to eat truma, and therefore it can't be done. However, the Mishnah continues, and this is within the view of Sumcha, says, Ulakohen beveis apras. A Kohen is allowed to set up his Eruv in a beis apras. What's a beis apras? A beis apras is a place, not a cemetery, but a place where there was a person buried, and they went ahead and they plowed the field, and the concern is that a person is going to walk on a bone. A Kohen's going to walk on a bone and become tummy. That's called a beis hapras. And the Mishnah over here is telling us, according to Sumchis, who normally says that it has to be something which is fit for the individual. Like Yisrael cannot set up an Eruv Truma, and yet a Kohen is allowed to set up an Eruv the beis hapras. He's not supposed to go into a beis hapras. A Kohen the halacha is should not go into beis hapras because of the possibility that he might become tummy. So why is it allowed? Rabbi Yehuda Shmuel, menapeach adam beis hapras v'holech. That a Kohen in this particular circumstance is allowed to walk like near the ground and blow on the ground, and it blows the sand, blows the dirt, and they'll see if there are bones there. In other words, it was just plowed, and the concern is maybe there's a bone that they're going to walk on, directly walk on. So as long as they're blowing, they'll blow away any sand, any dirt, and they'll see if they're going to walk on a bone. But otherwise, we don't have to worry. And therefore, normally we tell a Kohen, don't do this. This is not a good approach. You can't mess around like this and start blowing. It's not such a practical thing. For an Eruv, we're going to allow this flexibility. A part of this is presumably because, as we'll see soon, according to many views, you're only allowed to set up an Eruv in a situation where you're actually going to go ahead and do a mitzvah. In other words, if I'm setting up an Erev Tchuma because I want to go watch a basketball game a mile, 2 miles away, that's not an excuse. It's not an allowance to set up an Erev. Erev Tchuma is set up if a person's going to go for a Shabbos meal or for some other mitzvah purpose. Otherwise, you're not supposed to use the Erev Tchuma. Okay. Alternatively, we're talking about a Beis Hapras, this area of land which was trampled upon by many people. Once it's trampled upon by many people, we could assume that any of the bigger bones were crushed and made into small pieces, and therefore all you're going to have is very tiny pieces, tiny fragments of bone is not something which generates tumah, and that's why it's allowed. Okay, the Mishnah says further, Rabbi Yehuda Omer Af Beis Hakvaros. Rabbi Yehuda goes a step further. Whereas the Tana before said that a Kohen's allowed to set up his Eruv in a Beis Hapras, Rabbi Yehuda says you're allowed to set up an Eruv in a cemetery. So Tana, the Gemara, the Mishnah, it's explained why. Because the Kohen is able to partition himself off from the tumah in the cemetery, by sequestering himself off with a carriage, a crate, or a closet, and basically setting himself up in a situation where the Kohen goes ahead and places himself in a box. Okay, so, a box, if you have a box which is made up of that a person could fit in, that is a separate entity, right? So a Kohen could go into the Beis Hakvaros, into the cemetery, in this box, okay? And Kasavar, Yehuda holds that Ohel Zarok Shmei Ohel, that a moving Ohel, okay, it literally means a tent, but we mean like a box over here, is still considered a partition. Okay, this is a matter of debate. The Tanya was taught, we looked at the Tanya tonight, and this is a matter of dispute. The Tanya was taught in the Brisa. A person who enters a foreign country outside of Israel in an enclosed carriage, crate, or closet, Rebbe says there's halacha that we treat outside of Israel as tameh. Let's say a person wants to maintain a status of purity, and they're traveling outside of Israel, so they say, well, what am I going to do? So I'm going to go into a box. By the way, an equivalent of a box would be a car, right? In other words, it's a box. It's an enclosed area. The question is, Rebbe says, even when if you go outside of Israel into Chutz La'aretz, and you by definition become Tameh, if you go in a box, Rebbe says you're Tameh. Rabbi Yosef, Rabbi Yehuda, Matahar, Rabbi Yosef, Rabbi Yehuda says you're Tar. But what are they arguing about? Mar Savar, Ohel, Zark, Lav Shmei, Ohel. Rebbe holds that a moving box, whether it's a box or a car, something which is not permanent or stationary rather, that is something which is not considered a partition. If it's moving, it loses its status of partition. Mar Savar, Ohel, Zark, Shmei, Ohel. And Rabbi Yosef and Rabbi Yehuda holds that a moving tent, a moving box, is considered a partition. But Tanya, and that which was taught in Rice, Rabbi Yehuda Omer, was taught by Rabbi Yehuda, Ma'arvin lekohen tar b'truma tahor b'kever. They are allowed to make an error for a kohen who is tahar, even with truma that is tahar. Heichi azel. How does he get to the kever? How does he get there? B'shita teva migdal, with an enclosed carriage, crate, or closet. Again, this is this view of Rabbi Yehuda who holds that you can that if you have a even though it's moving box, it's still going to create a partition between the Kohen and Tumah. Okay, and that's why the Mishnah is telling us that according to the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda, who holds that a moving box is able to act as a partition, then you are able to set up, the Kohen is able to set his Eruv in a cemetery because he's able to get in there with a box. And the Gemara is going to analyze this a little bit further. V'kevan da'achta itamila. The Brisa which we just quoted above said you're allowed to make an Eruv for a Kohen who's tahar with truma that is tahar. The Gemara asks, how's the food still tahar? If the food so we know the guy's in the box. What about the food? How did the food get into sitting on the grave? How did it get there without becoming tameh? The Gemara answers, B'shelo huchshira. I'm taking out the word o based on different texts. Shenilosha b'mei peros. It was kneaded with fruit juice. Okay, so what does this mean? What this means is that whenever we have something which is tameh, it has to first become susceptible to tumah. It has to become something which is huchshar l'tumah. And the way it becomes huchshar l'tumah, the way it becomes susceptible to tumah, is that if a liquid falls on it, if it comes into contact with the liquid. So there's a whole list of different things that are liquid. Water is typically one of the things that causes something to be a liquid. So if you have a cake, you have some food which is made with water, that food is going to be susceptible to tumah. We're talking about food which is made with fruit juice. If it's made with fruit juice, it's not susceptible to tumah. The Gemara says, fine. Vechi maitila, fine. So we explained why the food is still tahora. We explained why the person is still tahar, the Kohen is still tahar. But how does the Kohen bring the truma to himself to eat it, right? So we have him in the cemetery. We have the food over here. How does he get the food, right? In other words, the whole notion of an eruv is that since the person is able to get that food, that's his living spot. But the guy still can't get it, even though he has his box brought him into the Beis Hakvaros, into the cemetery. The food is over there. How would he go ahead and eat the food? Because if he'd have to eat the food, he has to leave the box. The answer is with flat wooden utensils. Okay, flat wooden utensils are not susceptible to tumah. Flat meaning it's literally flat, like a paddle, like a spoon paddle. You know those spoon paddles, right? So that is the lo mekabel tumah. It's not susceptible to tumah. The Gemara says v'hakamal. Okay, granted, it's not susceptible to tumah, but when the Kohen holds that paddle this way, right? And it's over the Beis HaKvaros, right? He's trying to manipulate the food to pick it up, and he's holding it over the kever, over the grave. Then it is acting as an ohel, right? Whenever anything is under a roof, then this thing now, everything under becomes tamei as well. And this thing itself, the Kohen is holding onto a ohel which is tamei, onto a roof which is tamei, and therefore he should become tamei. So Gemara says, again, based on Rashi, achudei. He retrieves it in the narrow end. In other words, he doesn't use the paddle in the regular, the larger part. He flips it around. He uses the narrow part. Or imagine a person using chopsticks. In other words, something which is not thick enough. In order to be an ohel, it has to be a tefach large. And if it's smaller than that, then it's not going to be an ohel. Ask the Gemara, Hachi my tamid rabbanan. So in the Mishnah, we understood the rabbi said to go into a cemetery, that can't be done because they hold a moving this moving box is not something which partitions away from Tumah. By the way, this is how we rule, and that's why a Kohen can't come into a cemetery driving a car, right? Because according to Yehuda, a Kohen could very easy. We ever have a funeral with a Kohen, you're like, what do we do? Very simple, drive into the car, and that's a box, and it'd be fine, But the point is that we hold that a moving box is not a good partition, and that's why a Kohen cannot do so. But the Gemara asks, okay, so when it's in the Beis HaKvaros, you can't do so because the moving box is not partitioned from Tumah. But in a scenario where in the Brisa, which we just quoted above, which was a single grave, okay, have a stationary box, have the Kohen bend over with his chopsticks, get the food out, we're good to go. So the Gemara says, "Kasavri asur liknos bais bisuri hana." The Chachamim hold the reason they say it's forbidden that you can't use this erev is because they hold that you can't acquire a dwelling place with objects that are forbidden from benefits. What does that mean? That you are trying to acquire a living place on a grave. A grave is something which is forbidden to have benefit from. A grave is something, there is a halacha, very important halacha, that a grave, even the tombstone, you can't have any benefit from. Whole discussion, am I allowed to put my book? I come to a cemetery, I'm in a cemetery, I have my sitter. Am I allowed to put it on the tombstone? Seems like you cannot. There are different opinions, but the point is that you certainly can't go ahead and put your something which is not a sitter over there to rest on it. That's using it. You can't benefit from it. So the Gemara asked, wait a second, that means that Rabbi Yehuda says it's allowed, holds you are allowed to benefit from something which is asur b'ana. That makes no sense. How could that be? So the Gemara says, "Kasavar mitzvos lav lehanas ninu." Rabbi Yehuda holds that when you're doing something for a mitzvah, that's not called benefit. Okay, so what is that? What mitzvah are we talking about here? We're talking about making an eruv. Eruv is not a mitzvah. So this is based upon an opinion, which we're about to see in a moment, which we haven't spoken about until now, which is that when that there's a massive debate about eruv tchumen, are you allowed to do so to go to a basketball game? Non-mitzvah, or is it only allowed to be done for a mitzvah? So clearly we are of the opinion over here that it's being done only for a mitzvah. I mean, I'm doing it to go for a Shabbos meal, I'm doing it to visit a sick, whatever it might be. And therefore, since I'm doing it for a mitzvah purpose, and therefore the benefit that I'm getting of being able to go beyond the tchum, it's not a personal benefit, it's a mitzvah benefit. A mitzvah benefit, that's a different story. So ask the Gemara, so that means that if Rabbi Yehuda holds mitzvos lav lehanas ninu, that when you're doing a mitzvah, the benefit from a mitzvah is not called hana. That means the Chachamim who say that you can't use this eruv, they hold that even if it's done for a mitzvah, it still is a benefit, and that's why it can't be done. That means that the question of whether mitzvos you're able to benefit from that, whether we treat the benefit from mitzvah as a benefit, as an actual benefit, is machlokas tanaim. And Rava came along and said it as a straight statement, mitzvos lav lehanas ninu, and he didn't say it was machlokas tanaim. So Amalach Rava says, no. Isvir lehu de'em arvin el advar mitzvah. If they all held, he says, no, there's another way of understanding that machlokas in the Mishnah, which does not pose a question to his view. He says, if they all held that an eruv is only allowed to be made to facilitate the performance of a mitzvah, dikuli alma mitzvos lav lehanas ninu, they would both agree that mitzvos were not given for the purpose of that there's no personal benefit that comes out of a mitzvah. Okay? So what are they arguing about? Right? He has to give a new explanation as to what they're arguing about. Mar savar ema arvin el advar mitzvah. One opinion Rabbi Yehuda holds that the only time you're allowed to make an eruv is to do a mitzvah. Umar savar ma'arvin afilu dvar hashus. And the rabbis hold you're allowed to make an eruv even for a personal matter, not a mitzvah matter. Okay, so what does that have to do with anything? So let's plug it back in. We're talking about placing an eruv on a kever, on a grave, which normally you can't benefit from. So Rabbi Yehuda, who holds the only time you're allowed to make an eruv is for a mitzvah purpose, well, then it's fine, because the benefit that you're getting of making this eruv is not a personal benefit, it's a spiritual benefit, and therefore it's not forbidden to use the kever, to use this grave, is to bring about benefits. The Rabbanan who say you make an eruv, that the Kohen cannot make an eruv on the kever, on the grave, hold that you're allowed to make an eruv, even go to a basketball game. If that's the case, they say, well, you can't put an eruv on the grave because then you're getting personal benefit going to the basketball game, and that's why it can't be done. Ella Hadam Rav Yosef, the Gemara asks further, what about Rav Yosef, who said, Amar Arvin El Bar Mitzvah? Rav Yosef said, everyone agrees that you're not allowed to make an eruv you're only allowed to make an eruv for the sake of a mitzvah, which again is the way we rule. According to what Rava just said, then it's not agreed upon by all. It's actually machlokas tanaim, because that's the way Rava just explained to us that brisa and Mishnah. And that what they're arguing about is this exact case. Are you allowed to make an erev tchumen if it's a non-mitzvah purpose? Why did Rav Yosef just say it as a definitive statement? Let him say that it only follows one viewpoint within a machlokas tanaim. So Rav Yosef has to give a different way of understanding that machlokas about the Kohen placing the Erev on the kever. What is that? Really, everyone agrees, like I said, that you could only make an Erev for a mitzvah. And everyone agrees that mitzvahs are not given for the purpose of that you don't get any, that personal benefit that comes out of a mitzvah is not benefits. What are the arguments? So the argument is as follows. When you set up an Erev Tchumen, okay, so back in the day, Ner Yisrael was, when I learned in Ner Yisrael, there was a debatable, but there was a gap of space, which some argued is too large of a gap of space, and therefore if you're ever walking from the yeshiva to get to Pikesville, to get to the Jewish community, you'd have to set up an Erev Tchumen, okay? So we would go to this place, put, a Powerade bottle, whatever it is, like a drink that's enough for 2 drinks or 2 meals, great, and you put it down there, and now you have your Erev Tchumen. I never, ever picked up, I'm sure there's like a pile of drinks over there because people just left it there and like no one went to get it, right? So that is the question over here. The question is like this. When I go and place it there, I'm not really benefiting from the place itself. I never plan on, I don't care for it to be protected in that place so that, on Shabbos, when I'm walking, I'm going to go get the drink. No. As soon as the Erev kicks in, I'm good to go. I don't care about that food anymore. If you were to tell me, because halachically, once the Erev is there when Shabbos begins, it doesn't matter if the Erev flies away after, if someone eats the Erev, as long as the Erev is there when Shabbos began, you're good. So if you were to tell me, by the way, someone came and stole your Powerade bottle after Shabbos began, I'd be like, who cares, right? So the first opinion, Rav Yehuda holds that I don't care about the fact that my food is there. I'd say, who cares? And therefore, I'm not actually getting any benefit from the space over there, because putting it on the gravesite, yes, it's true, it happens to physically be there, but I'm not getting any personal benefit because I don't care if it's there. I don't care if I don't need the being in the grave, being on that grave is not protected, not helping me in any way, and therefore there is no hana, right? There is no hana, there's no benefit, and so that's why I say you're allowed to place it there, because I'm allowed to place it there because I'm not getting any personal benefit. The only benefit I'm getting is I'm allowed to do the mitzvah. I'm allowed to go do Bikur Cholim. I'm allowed to go and do a Shabbos meal. So that's benefit, but it's mitzvah benefit. The benefit of having my drink over there, I don't need that drink. I'm never going to pick it up ever. The other opinions of the rabbis say, no, but since I could pick it up, let's say I was walking, it was a hot day, I'm like, oh my gosh, it's so hot, I'm on my way to Pikesville. I'm like, wait a second, I have a bottle of Powerade sitting over there. I could go and get it. And since I could go and get it, therefore I do have a benefit. I do have a possible personal benefit, and therefore the rabbi says you can't put it there, since it's true. According to Rav Yosef, it's true according to Rav Yosef that you're going to do a mitzvah, and therefore the hana of the Erev, the benefit of going to do the mitzvah, that's not real benefit. But since I could theoretically go and get that Powerade bottle and drink it for myself, that's personal benefits, that would be hana, that would be coming from a kever, from someone who's asur b'hana, and therefore I can't place the Erev over there. We'll stop over there. Have a great day. Good vach.